Yeah, go ahead. I heard a clap. I don't know if somebody was slapping a fly, but if you want to clap before anything actually happens, I'm for that. Absolutely. All right, we have a small but mighty crowd, and I want to say there's two other excellent panels, but you, as Joe Lehman said earlier today, have chosen wisely. This is actually going to be the best session of the entire day, other than Brad's breakfast talk, which was really exceptional. Oh, Brad's in the room. I didn't even realize that. My name's John Tillman. I'm the co-director, as it says up there, for Atlas Network Center for the U.S. and Canada. I'm also chairman of the Illinois Policy Institute, and I've worn a variety of hats in the movement. My co-director for the U.S. and Canada Center is Neils Veldhuis, on my far left.
Thank you.
Runs the Fraser Institute. Niels, why don't you, well, actually, let me just introduce the other panelists. We'll do this. Greg and Lydia. See, I'm very formal, and that's how we're going to kind of go today. This is just going to be a very informal conversation. We're going to just start off having some chatter about what's going on in the U.S. and Canada with respect to civil discourse, the media, public policy, the threats to our democracy, which I do think are existential. And each of my co-panelists here will just say a little bit about them and their background before they launch into a couple of thoughts. Niels, why don't you start us off, and we'll work our way down.
Yeah, thanks, John. I think you've already said most of what I was going to say. I'm the president of the Fraser Institute in Canada. We're both a national and a subnational organization, also do obviously a lot of international work with our economic freedom and our human freedom projects with the Cato Institute. So I'm delighted to be here and look forward to the chat.
And let's go with ladies first. Lydia, next to me. We were just talking about parenting here and the very complications of it a minute ago, but we're sort of trying to parent the North American continent. So tell us a little bit about what you're doing to help out and what parental advice we should start by giving.
Oh, no pressure. Well, so I'm a professor of political science at the University of Windsor, and I've got a gig right now doing the Humanities Research Group, which is, I don't know why they invited me to do that, because it's usually far left, BIPOC and identity politics, but for some reason I got the gig, so I can manage my own program this year, so that's exciting, and so I'm trying to infiltrate it with a few free market ideas. And have also had a long association with the Fraser Institute. I started working there in 1988, and I've been a senior fellow since somebody was born. I know one of my children was born that year, 1996. So that's my advice is on parenting. I'll pass for now. Maybe we'll get into that.
You're so wise.
Well, I'll give in to Greg later on about parenting.
Go ahead, Greg. Introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your bio and what you're working on.
My name is Greg Lukianoff. I'm the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. I defend free speech and academic freedom on America's college campuses. I'm also the co-author of Coddling the American Mind with my friend Jonathan Haidt, which is a book about why students that were hitting campus around 2014 were so different than before. And I'm still a little mystified as to why I'm on this panel, so I think we're going to find that out together.
One thing we're going to do that we don't normally do in these kind of panels is if there's something that's just absolutely gripping you in the moment someone's speaking and you want to ask a question right then, feel free. Just raise your hand, and if we can see you, we'll call on you in the moment. We will do Q&A for the last 20 minutes, so you'll also get a chance to ask questions at the end. So, I don't know. We're going to find out right now, Greg. Oh, yeah. We're talking about mic positioning. There's this whole debate about, I know, Lydia's reminding people of, hold the mic just a couple inches from your phone or your face, and really doing a good job of reminding us of all the important things about mic management, which we were discussing earlier. But meanwhile, everything's going great on free speech on college campuses, isn't it, Greg? Tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah. I just had an article, a feature, it just came out this morning, actually, for Reason magazine called The Second Great Age of Political Correctness. And basically, it's making the argument that from 1985 to 1995, you had the first great age of political correctness, which is when, only 20 years after the free speech movement, and only 10 years after the Supreme Court actually recognized meaningful free speech on public campuses, at least, you started having pushes for speech codes. You started having a real clampdown on speech, which ended actually at my alma mater 2 years before I got there at Stanford in 1995. And there was a kind of collective idea that essentially PC had been defeated and everything was going to be fine. But from 95 to 2015, things just got a lot worse. And I worked at Fire. I started at Fire in 2001, and it was already super easy to get in trouble for what you said on college campuses. Then in 2014, the students really became a big part of the problem in a way that they hadn't been for the previous chunk of my career. And I will say this, 2020 was absolutely the worst year I've seen in my entire career for free speech or academic freedom on campus.
Wow. Lydia, what would you say is going on in Canada? You're in Windsor. Are we seeing the same dynamics in Canada, or is it different in Canada?
I think in Canada, part of it is just, I think it's situational, and I think it's campus specific. So there are some campuses that are very politicized. University of Toronto, for example. A lot of the campuses in Quebec are especially sort of anti-free speech, and certainly in Canada, I think the focal point has been Jordan Peterson. So he's a Canadian psychologist, has a very strong YouTube following, and he's seen as very polarizing. And it's not really on what he says, because when you look at what he says, it's not that objectionable. He's just saying, I'm not interested in compelled speech. But he gets shouted down, he gets shouted out of, he gets deprogrammed effectively. But I think that those are in specific campuses. So, for example, at University of Windsor, the fact that I've been there for 20 years suggests that things aren't so bad. And I have programmed controversial speakers. You know, I've programmed Deirdre McCloskey. But I think the way I've done it and the way other people have done it is you do it inclusively. You say, come and have a conversation. And I, in fact, have a reading group that was actually funded by the Templeton Foundation called Reading Liberty, and I do a call to everybody. Come out and check it out. And the first one I did was Deirdre McCloskey, and we purposely included the groups that are usually marginalized. And she was great. Right? If you need a speaker, McCloskey's your woman, because she did talks to the gender groups. She did talks to economics, political science. So that's how you include them. And after reading Greg's book, I think that some of the people who get deplatformed almost look for that controversy. So it's sort of, what is your goal? Is it that you just want clicks, that you just want controversy, or that you really have a message to put out? Because I think the people who have a free market message to put out can find homes on university campuses. It's just a matter of how they position their message.
I think what's interesting about all this, though, going back to the speed with which this has changed from the free speech cases that protected free speech on college campuses to speech codes, as you alluded to earlier. I'm curious, Niels, in Canada, from your point of view, especially because you're in Vancouver, and very much like the United States, it's different in the West in Canada than it is in Toronto and the eastern provinces. How is that different? And also, what's your observation about the speed with which it's changed, and where do you think it's taking us?
Yeah, I would agree. It's changed quite dramatically. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face now is that this cohort is graduating and they're entering into the workforce, and you're seeing the pressure that they're putting on corporations. And I think actually one of the greatest threats that's not talked about enough for economic freedom and capitalism is the capitalists themselves, particularly those in the big institutions, big businesses. And you're seeing the advocacy of employees. If you look at McKinsey, I mean, these are smart worldwide consultants. They had 1,000 of them walk out because McKinsey does consulting for companies that are large GHG emitters. I mean, this is really insane when you think about those people go home to their homes that are heated by oil and gas and sometimes coal. They drive there in their cars. I mean, they really are completely detached and illiterate from what makes their lives so great. And that's a huge challenge for us, because the corporations are both being pressured by their employees, and then you're getting this, which I also don't think is talked enough about, this pressure on ESG, environmental, social, and governance, which is, I think, de facto regulation. So big issues. When it comes to school and free speech, I mean, we've long at the Fraser Institute had education programs that have bypassed the university. I mean, it's gotten so bad that we can't even hold these discussions on university, so we take them off campus. We hold them in hotels across Canada, and students get to come and listen to views that they don't otherwise get, and they're hugely popular. And we do the same thing for teachers, which is interesting because teachers are usually pinned down by the unions in terms of what they can teach, but there's a huge appetite to teach at least a somewhat balanced curriculum. And we teach teachers how to teach really controversial issues like, is capitalism good for the poor, into their classrooms. So I think we're having some success, but I really believe, I'm a former educator. I was at a university for 10 years, and I think we've seen a real shift very quickly.
So I wanted to ask Lydia, other than Milo Yiannopoulos, who were you thinking of when you said there are people invited to campus just to provoke?
Someone like Ann Coulter as well, I think, would be in that bucket. Yeah, but Milo is the big linchpin. I mean, even Jordan Peterson to some extent, he does provoke, and it's sometimes difficult to break through to hear what his message is because the image of him has been set in popular culture, partly to his, I think he made some mistakes, but also just the fact that his deterrents are so vocal in their objection to anything he says that you can't hear what he wants to say. And so, sometimes some people are their worst own enemies in that respect, and they don't know how to finesse the system. Because, the point remains that we have an obligation. If we want to get our message out, we want it to be heard. So if we're going to be controversial, okay, there's a cost to that, and that could be that you're deplatformed. But if you are reasonable and you approach the arguments as arguments, people are much more likely to hear you, and perhaps they can be persuaded.
Yeah, I mean, we maintain a database, our disinvitation database, because this is something we saw at FIRE for a long time, that people, that every season we called it disinvitation season, and people would be disinvited from speaking on campus. And for most of that time, because you tended to be more conservative speakers, they didn't get a lot of play, and people did not notice. It was in 2014 where you start having people like Christine Lagarde from the IMF and the dean of UC Berkeley be disinvited, and I just really don't want anyone to leave with the impression that most of the people who are getting disinvited from campus are Milo.
Right, and I'm just saying there's a difference between Canada and the United States. We don't do as much, but
We have free speech still.
I don't know. We're just more polite. But there is an example. Marie Heinen, who is a litigator in Toronto, she does a lot of defense, and so she defended Jian Ghomeshi. For those who don't know, he was a CBC anchor on a popular radio show, and he had been accused of sexual harassment, violence against women. So he was deplatformed, and because she defended him successfully, now she's doing her book tour, and there's been 2 campuses that have basically invited her and then disinvited her. So I'll probably be inviting her. We'll see how it goes. I'll keep you updated.
Niels, do you have something else you want to add there?
Yeah, I think this is a really important nuance. And I'm really of the belief that this is very much like a football game. It's about inches, right? You got to fight for every single inch. And if you don't fight for every single inch and you try and play on their field, they're just going to move the goalpost. And sooner or later, what you get is a whole wide variety of people that can't speak on campus, not even just the most controversial ones. And it's the same thing, I believe, in the corporate world. You have some perfectly reasonable entrepreneurs and business leaders that just want to work within the framework, and they're willing to move over here and then work within this framework. So it went from corporate social responsibility to stakeholder capitalism to ESG to something they can't even measure, and they just keep moving and inching until they get to where they want, and they'll never give up. So to me, you got to fight for that first inch.
In the Janus case, Justice Alito this was a case involving essentially the free speech, free right of association of government union members. And one of the points he made in his ruling was that if you're forced to pay union fees, agency fees to the union that you disagree with, you are being compelled to speak. And I think what is really interesting to me, even though that was a narrow decision on union rights and within that construct, it really is applicable, I think, to what's going on today where silence is violence and all the rest of it. How did we go from a place where you generally had American consensus on what free speech meant and why, even though some people spoke abhorrently, we all agreed that saving that principle was an American value that we wanted to cherish and preserve, and of course a right. How did we get to this place where so many on the left are perfectly willing to use authoritarian power, social ostracizing people through social means, and all the rest of it, where it is ironically now the right, or the libertarian right, that are the advocates and the protectors of free. Everything is sort of reversed from the way it was in the 60s. How did this all happen?
Well, it's kind of sad that when I speak at high schools, and I try to increasingly speak at feeder high schools that are influential on our most influential universities, And I have to explain that, historically speaking, in a democracy, of course, 51% is protected by the vote, and the rich and powerful are protected by being rich and powerful. It's not a coincidence that the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement all began having some traction in the 1950s. I was about to say in the American 1950s. We had this decade you might not have heard of. And it was only because the First Amendment started being strongly interpreted, because you don't need free speech as a separate value other than to protect the opinions that don't have the backing of power or aren't majoritarian. So really, very simply, what happened on campus was that you had an overwhelming supermajority of people who were politically homogenous come to power, and as soon as you actually have power, you tend to see free speech as an impediment to your agenda rather than something that is actually helpful. So lack of viewpoint diversity is a big part of the story here. And I have to explain this over and over again. And I have to deal with the fact that between Harvard and Yale, they have $100 billion just sitting to one side. That's their endowments if you consider them together. Yale has more, if you add faculty and administrators, they have more employees than they have students at Yale. And every single one of our members of our Supreme Court either attended Yale or Harvard at some point. And they still manage to ask like they are actually the underdogs on campus, all the while, people are getting in trouble for increasingly nonsensical reasons, and for the most part, when they're getting in trouble for opinions, pretty mainstream ones.
Yeah, I think a good part of it's also bureaucratic capture, and you see this at the high school level, and certainly in Canada, where the unions have captured the education ministries. They become the dominant maker of the curriculum. And so what happens is, you get one dominant view that takes over. And, in Canada, we're seeing things like a social justice overlay on the entire curriculum. That's being forced into the schools by the unions, so that when your kids are in math class in grade 5 and you start learning ratios, you have to listen to the fact that a CEO makes whatever 150 times more than an average worker, without giving the students any sort of background in terms of productivity or risk-taking or anything of that. It's actually just, here is it, and this is supposed to be wrong, and that's the way they teach it. And so I'm really worried about the K-12 education system, particularly within Canada, given this bureaucratic capture. And I think you're seeing two potential avenues for change. And certainly you saw it in Virginia. One is school choice, where parents are just finally fed up and say, look, I actually want control over my kids' education, and so maybe that will produce different kids. And the advent of technology will start breaking down some of those the barriers to more parental involvement. I mean, in BC, for example, where I'm from, British Columbia, we have 1 in 8 students now go to an independent school. So it's every time you see something happen in the public system, you get an increased demand from parents.
I think, in fact, school choice is going to be a major initiative of Atlas Network in the next coming year and beyond, because it seems like this is a particularly ripe time for all the reasons you just said. Did you have something you wanted to add, Lydia?
Yeah, because I'm looking at it from sort of being inside the university, and it seems to me that certainly is the faculty unions, which are quite powerful. I mean, we just had our contract renegotiated, and I've been on the negotiating team for the faculty association before, but I was all about my own self-interest, was like, give me the money. But apparently this time, because the money side was already legislated, we only have a 1% increase, the faculty decided that their desires would be all about equity, diversity, and so they had to, they rewrote the entire contract to deal with those issues and to put in all that inclusivity language. But the other element that I think doesn't get as much say is the students' union. And the students' unions are incredibly powerful on Canadian campuses, and they really push for a lot of students' rights. And, initially it was fine. It was like, do evaluations of professors so we know which ones suck and which ones are good. Well, that's all fine. Ironically, that's become part of tenure and renewal, and it used to be transparent so that students can see those results. Now nobody can see them except your administrator and your dean. So it's like, okay, what was the point of that exercise? And there's all sorts of problems with that. But the other thing that they continually pressure administration to relax the rules. So for example, I can't have any assignments in the first 2 weeks of the semester. I can't have any assignments due in the last week of the semester. It's a 12-week semester, so I only have like 9 weeks that I can do any evaluation of the students. And we have things about accommodations. If you have different disabilities, great, I don't have a problem with your accommodations. But then those accommodation letters start to get really broad. So I had one student that not only did she like have all these accommodations, but she was allowed to have a cheat sheet. And it's like, well, I don't let anybody have a cheat sheet. How come you have a cheat sheet? It's like, well, because I have brain lesions. Like, so I had to change it for so my thing is all about, I'm about inclusivity.
I had a hangover and they didn't give me a cheat sheet.
It was also she could negotiate her deadlines usually if they're sick, you get a note and blah, blah, blah. But then, it was a compassion. And then they keeps on ratcheting it up. So it was you have to accommodate them for any kind of compassion. It's like, okay, and I've always had this. If you die or if your grandmother dies, just send me the note and I'll give you extensions. I had a student who was actually the president of the student union quote me that article in the bylaws, and he wanted me to accommodate him because his dog had died. And I'm like, we've gone from my dog ate my homework to my dog died as excuse not to hand stuff in. So that is an incredibly amount of power that the students' unions now impose on university faculty and administration. And again, in our campus, they really were leading complaints about discrimination on the basis of racial orientation.
I think what's interesting about that story, and it's been kind of a thread in a lot of conversations, including the earlier one we've just had, which is this victimization mindset of the left, that everybody is a victim by group identity, by whatever. I mean, your dog died. Now you're a victim because your dog died. I remember that my dog died this summer. He was 14 years old. I was pretty broke up about it, but I still showed up at work the next day. This idea of victimization permeates everything now, and I think it's actually part of what we're talking about, because the left's argument is that rapacious capitalism and freedom, as defined by the founding principles of this country and essentially the North American continent, they let the crazy people who are maybe harder working than you, or born into an advantage, or maybe they were born at a disadvantage, but they just worked harder than you did. They're taking advantage of the system, and you're a victim. And it's a very seductive argument that only the government can come in and properly put its foot on the scale to create equity and a proper allocation of resources. And they take the moral high ground by doing that. It's very hard to argue against that person who says, well, I've got this problem. We don't want to be mean-spirited. We all want to have empathy on the one hand. On the other hand, this idea that everybody in this room could come up with some reason why you should stink, right? Why you should be no good. You overcame it. Everybody has something. And people overcome. The Western construct has been overcoming, not sort of accepting your victimization. And I think this is one of the dangerous tenets of the left's mindset these days.
Can I throw something in there? You did say we could interrupt, so I'm going to take advantage of that. Back far corner. Hi. There we are.
Thank you. Back left from our point of view. You're hiding out. We can see you now. Go.
Peter McCaffrey from the Alberta Institute in Canada. And I wanted to throw one thing out, because it seems like there's a consistent thread between everything that all of you have said, which is, student unions, education system. I'd throw media in there as well. It's probably less of an issue here in Canada, here in the US, because you mentioned the Janus case and some of your labor legislation. But especially in Canada, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that government is funding one side of the debate. And you can add up the budgets of every think tank in the world, and it would be a drop in the bucket compared to the amount of money that just the Canadian government is spending on political activism, right? So how do we challenge that when the schools are indoctrinating people, the student unions are, the media is, and everything has this skew on it now, right? And we're funding our opponents' arguments.
That's a great question. Who wants to go?
Yeah, I think it is a great question, and I would add business to that as well. So the cards are stacked against us, no question. I think when it comes to you got to find workarounds, and we have to find opportunities. So to me, the media, the opportunity there is the digital platforms. I know there's another session going on, but I think it's a tremendous way to get at people without a filter, or partially without a filter. And if you can connect with them and connect with them directly through email, all the better. In terms of education, I mentioned the two-prong approach. I don't think we're going to change the education establishment. I don't think we're going to change the K-12 education system. But going around it to educate teachers directly, going around it to educate high school students directly. I mean, we do high school programming, and even just simply teaching them basic economics, something they don't get in their classroom, at least not in Canada. I know in US states it's different. But getting them to think through an economic lens that, you know what, there is such a thing as a trade-off, and that, these trade-offs and your decisions have costs and they have consequences, I think changes the lens through which these students look. And I think in part, it makes them just a little bit more critical. And if we can do that, we can start to create some change. And then instilling some competition in education. I think that both at K-12 and university, I think is part of the answer. Whether that comes through technology or comes through parental choice, we have to take advantage of both of those opportunities. And to me, that's the way forward.
Yeah, I think, do you want to go, Lydia? You have some? Go ahead.
Oh, actually, the word safety. I mean, I was intrigued by Greg's. I mean, I'm going to recommend you. I guess I'm plugging your book, because the idea of safety, I think, is an interesting one. Because in some respects, I almost think that this last 2 years of hell, of lockdowns and restrictions and safety, has changed people's opinions. And that I think that there's, I've been in the game long enough that there's the ebb and flows, and I think the pendulum's going to swing back, because people, sure, they felt safe from COVID, but they just lost so many other things. They lost their mental health. They lost, people didn't get surgeries for, like things that they really needed, because the government was so restrictive. And I can see that on campus. I can see students saying, okay, enough. So they're just exhausted with being safe. And the ability to take risks, I think, might encourage more people to actually come out and be open-minded about different points of view.
Yeah, the essence of that question, I think, is how do we compete in this world where they have all the seeming advantages, and they're using our money to actually build those advantages? And I would just say that a couple things. One, think about the year 2021 when Joe Biden came in as President of the United States with all the media behind him, the entire commanding heights of K through 12, the academy, corporate communications, the medical communications world, Hollywood, entertainment, all the news, all the mainstream news media, legacy news media in support of him. And yet his opinion, his approval rating has plummeted to the second worst ever and still going down. How did that happen? It happened because of two things. One, there's been investments in alternative media, so people are, as I think the term Greg might have used was a workaround. There's been a workaround on that dominance, and people are getting information differently. And especially people in the middle are actually being reached in the soft left. And I think obviously everybody's pointing to Virginia, New Jersey elections as an example of that. And then secondly, they're selling cancer. They're selling a dependency victimization mindset. They're selling the idea that if you buy into their narrative, you might be a dependent, and you no longer have to worry about your food, your shelter, your clothing, your education, your health care. We'll take care of you. But what they're saying to you is you have an upside cap on your potential. There's a dependency ceiling. We're selling human aspiration, which is the actual normal human condition. People are always interested in mitigating risk, always balanced against the opportunity for a better tomorrow than we have today. That's what we're selling. That's much more attractive, and we've figured out a better way to do it. And by the way, I think one of the ways we need to do it better is we need to invest in infrastructure outside of the public policy movement in media, entertainment, and elsewhere, which I'm involved with to some degree. Any other, Matt? Let's just go to questions, people. Let's keep it rolling.
So last week, PEN America did a forum in New York where they said they had writers, and they said, are writers still free to write what they want? And you had John McWhorter, but then you had others who you would expect to be very much toe the line on PC things. But has this gotten so big that it's starting to affect so many people who say, well, wait a minute, why should I be constrained? And I'm a writer. I'm supposed to be free to express. And they talked about, American Dirt, which was like a white person who wrote a Mexican story, and is that wrong? And where are the lines there? At the same time, I'm seeing more appetite for people that I think there's still something in us, and maybe it's never going to get big enough, but it's like I don't want to just hear what makes me feel good. I'm curious to see reasonable people give their best arguments for things I disagree with. And you've got Russell Brand, who's getting a huge following now because he keeps doing that. He keeps bringing people, Jordan Peterson, others, that he doesn't agree, and and he's like a nihilist Marxist, but he is against choosing one of these two ridiculous sides and more interested in having just conversations. And so in comedy, you're seeing this with Galifianakis and Seinfeld and Chappelle, who are like, Bill Maher, free speech matters, but am I just grasping at people who are old enough that they are starting to use that? Well, I'm an old liberal, and I'm seeing that more and more, and I want to say, like, maybe you're a classical liberal, but that's another way to say that. But maybe the pendulum's going to swing back because it's starting to just get too ridiculous, and enough thought they were on the right side of it now are getting in the crosshairs, and they don't identify with that.
Go ahead, Greg.
I'm glad you mentioned John McWhorter, who's on our board, and I recommend both. He came out with 2 books this year, which one is called 9 Nasty Words, and the other one's called Woke Racism, and I highly recommend them both. Kind of the point of the Reason article that I wrote was that we kind of thought it was all over in 1995, and because there were some signs of improvement, and one of them was that PC became a joke, and that's the same thing with wokeness. Essentially, like, wokeness has become at least kind of, sort of, a little bit a joke, and the term, even some people are advocating getting rid of it. But here's my point, though. We kidded ourselves. Like, essentially, I think that there could be sort of a situation in which, John McWhorter now has a column at the New York Times, Barry Weiss is popular, there's a couple sort of symbolic actions here and there. Well, thank goodness that's over. It's going to keep getting worse unless we actually decide this time that we need some serious structural change and reform. And when it comes to higher education, I mean, we've accepted a situation where, and this is just a guess on, so I run a nonprofit. We're about $18 million organization. And you're expected to have relatively low overhead, which is administration plus development plus fundraising. If you were to apply that to a lot of the colleges in the U.S., the most influential ones, they have like 80% overhead, and they're still nonprofits. They have, like I said, $100 billion to one side between 2 schools, and they're still nonprofits. So I think that we should be considering things as radical, something that I think would actually fix things fairly quickly, because we don't have student unions the same way you have in Canada. It's the administrators who are overwhelming the problem. But if we were able to lower the overhead, and something that would help things a lot is if students could declare bankruptcy on their student loans, but the school itself had to pay for that. That would get their attentions very quick, but unfortunately we've moved over to the federal government. And yeah, there are so many profound things we need to do. And one of the reasons why I was on the New York Times argument last week, the podcast about University of Austin. And I don't know if University of Austin, this is an experimental new college started in Austin by Joe Lonsdale with a lot of my friends, including McWhorter and my co-author Haidt, Pinker, a lot of our friends and allies. We need more experimentation. In the U.S., you're kidding yourself if you think Yale and Princeton and Stanford are not going to be influential in 50 years. Even in order just to have some influence there, you have to start getting some of the best and brightest going to alternative versions to get their attention.
Yeah, I think John has a question up front here, where whoever has the microphone. I think what's interesting about all of this is the sort of root cause of all this. The crushing of dissent has been going on for some time. I gave a speech in 2013 in Chicago to the American Legislative Exchange Council's annual meeting, and part of that theme was this idea that this is not a passing fade that's going to go away after the next election. This is a strategy on their part, and the reason they have this strategy of crushing dissent, which we now call canceling and all the rest of it, is because they cannot tolerate open discussion and debate in a civil way. They have to shut us down because they know our arguments win. So from a strategic response, we have to understand we need to invest in the capacity to continue to compete to reach the hearts and minds of the American voters, which we are doing. And I'm very encouraged by what is going on in terms of investments, both in the for-profit and not-for-profit space, to reach the American people. John, you have a question?
Can I just
yeah,
add-
Niels, go
just,
ahead.
Just
Go
one,
ahead, Niels.
one quick sec. I mean, because this pendulum thing, I think, is a really important issue, because none of us would be here today if we didn't think the pendulum was capable of swinging back. And we don't know where it's going to come from, and I think that's also key. I mean, you have to have solutions, you have to be innovative, and even I just look at Canada from the mid-1990s to the Great Recession in 2009. I mean, and just the dramatic change in government in terms of, like, in 1992, Canadian governments were 54% of GDP, right? Over half. This is astounding, right? We go through this period where the Wall Street Journal calls us an honorary member of the third world, calls the Canadian dollar a Canadian peso. This is John Fund at the Wall Street Journal. Then we go through this period from 95 to 2005, where this overall size of the government goes from 54 down to 39. I mean, that's a massive change. In fact, we had a government lower that was smaller than the US government, which is astounding, and most Americans don't know this. So change can happen. You don't know what the linchpin of change is going to be, but you have to be ready for the change. And so I just think it's so important for organizations like Atlas and think tanks to have the solution ready when people wake up and say, okay, this is wrong, we need to fix it.
John.
When you say to the average human being sort of the crisis in higher education, the kind of person who doesn't come to something like this, they're going to say the cost of tuition, the cost of the education. There's the old saw that sometimes if you have one problem, you just have a problem. If you have two problems, sometimes they can cancel each other out. There is, as you were sort of alluding to, Greg, there's a component of like how much all of this costs. Mark Perry at AEI just came out with a list of like, I think Ohio State has 132 people in its DEI department. I mean, I'm the father of a high school senior. If my son were to fall like so far from grace as to attend Ohio State, go blue, like I would be really bothered by the fact that there was tens of millions of dollars going to pay all these people on the campus, and that his tuition would be going to that. Is there an opportunity to sort of take that Maslow's pyramid and jam it back down their throats of look at how much all this stuff is costing you? Hey, students are complaining about your tuition bill. Hey, parents are complaining about the tuition bill. This actually costs like for real money, and to really like make that a key part of the argument against this?
I absolutely do, and it's one of the first things I always mention. On the podcast, that was the first thing. I'm like, even if it was just that higher education in the U.S. is too expensive and too bureaucratized, that would be reason alone to want something like the University of Austin to exist. And here's the thing that I've heard reliably for my entire career. They're going to try to tell you that the $70,000 a year you need to go to St. Lawrence, Sarah Lawrence, for example, one of the more expensive colleges in the U.S., only covers half of the cost of educating a single student. And I'm always like, give me $140,000 and I will educate the living hell out of a lot of students. So I do think that there's an opportunity for much more impressive alternatives. And one of the things that's really affected the way I look at all of this is as an employer. And it really has changed my thinking on so much of this stuff, because we have about 70 people at Fire, or probably 100 within the next year or so. And when I see someone who has a Yale or a Harvard or a Princeton degree, I can guess that they're probably pretty smart and they're probably pretty hardworking. I can guess nothing else. I cannot guess if they understand statistics. I do not know if they know how to write. I do not know if they know how to research, and that's crazy. So some of these alternatives, if they could just reliably guarantee to employers that you're getting not just someone who is bright and hardworking, but someone who actually understands fundamental things that you need to understand the world, that could really be a game changer. So so at the end of this article, I talk about Minerva University in San Francisco as an interesting model, University of Austin, which I'm excited about. There's Staley's in South Carolina, which I know a lot less about, Ralston, but I do think that employer-focused way of looking at it might be a way to undercut the Harvards and the Yales.
Excellent. We have a question right here.
Yeah, two question comments. One, I'd like to get back to what Niels was saying earlier on when he said that he mentioned Virginia, I guess, the parents wanted to take control of the children. I don't think that's exactly what happened, but I think what happened is the fact that because of the COVID and the fact that remote education, the parents became aware of what the children were learning at school. And they were not always aware of that before. Now, it doesn't mean that they want necessarily to take control, but at least they want to have a say. And when the governor or the candidate governor says that the parents shouldn't have a say, that's going to the other extreme. So that's one aspect. There's a difference, I think, between taking control and being aware and not being aware to express and able to express an opinion. The other element, which is on the university system, in my close family, I have 2 university professors, my daughter and my son-in-law. They are both professors in a state university in the United States. And they are very liberal and progressive. And they're telling me that one of the problems now that they are all facing is the fact that the students want a degree. That's all they care about. They don't care about education. They don't care about learning something. They see, because of the cost, what you were saying about the cost of education, they say it's costing so much, even if it's a state university, that I want my degree. And then anything that's a distraction from that, like getting into debate. And the other thing they hate is being non-conform to the model. In other words, if you're a different personality, you're not part of the crowd, and then immediately rejected by the community. So they want to be there, get their degree, do as little as possible, and get on with their life. And they don't want to, my days, I was educated in Europe. We were doing, of course we wanted to have a job, but at least we wanted to have an education, to learn something, and we were always interested in getting into debate. Now they're not interested in debate. They want conformity and free.
Go ahead, Niels.
Yeah, sorry. My comments on the parents waking up was just that. I mean, I think you're right. Parents did wake up and are waking up, but we have to use those opportunities for change. And I think that's happening, in all kinds of different areas. I mean, inflation, while it's disastrous for economies, is a huge opportunity for our movement. Because that's what wakes people up, particularly in the middle, that don't care about policy, they don't care about politics necessarily. But when their standard of living, their purchasing power goes down, they put their head up and go, well, hold on, what's going on, right? And the same thing with parents. In fact, I think it's the same thing with the energy crisis that's developing in Canada and the United States. And Republicans finally, I think, have caught on to the fact that, hold on a second, what we're actually doing is walking into an energy crisis, much like what's happening in places like Germany and the United Kingdom, and waking up and saying, okay, how can we use this as an opportunity to change course? And I think that's the way we have to look at education. That's the way we have to look at inflation and other opportunities. And that's why it's so important to have the solutions there. And pendulums take a long time to swing because there's just vested interest groups that prohibit the quick change. And we've certainly seen that in Canada on all kinds of different areas, including healthcare, where the population is way ahead of the politician. I mean, the politician is ultimately a laggard because they're being swayed by the special interest groups.
That was the point I was making earlier. Is people can see inflation with their own eyes. They can see the debacle and the type of withdrawal from Afghanistan with their own eyes. They can see the crisis at the border, whatever your views on immigration are. They can see what's going on there and the inhumanity of it with their own eyes. They can see when their children come home or they're on the Zoom thing, what's going on with teaching their children that they're racist and white supremacists with their own eyes. People see that. It's very hard to cover that up. It's too pervasive. Lydia.
I wanted to pick up on your comment about the education aspect of it. Again, I think the idea of the high price of education, especially the Yale, the Harvard, is that it's the commodification, is not of education, but of the brand, right? It's like you have a Yale degree, that means something, you have a Harvard degree. And so we see that even, at a small university like myself, the students think that they're buying the degree. They don't understand that they're buying the education. But conversely, or similarly, on the other side, professors don't know what business they're in, right? A lot of them think that they're just there to churn out students and make sure that there is enrollment. They forget that they're our business. Like I've been in so many meetings where I go, okay, let's remember what our core business is. And it's like, how dare you call this a business? It's like, well, it is, right? Like, we should have a mission and we're here to educate, and that's the focus thing. And so if you treat the students like they are customers of education rather than just people to mill through and make sure that recruitment's happy and we get our government grants. For us, our numbers are based on government grants rather than, they really do only pay half the tuition that the government gives. But it's that disconnect that faculty actually don't know what business they're in, and that's the other half of the problem. And that's why students want to game the system. I mean, I don't blame them. Like, why would you do the hard work if you're not getting the prestige of the Harvard or the Yale, or you are even, and you figure, well, at the end of the day, I bought this degree, And that's what my money paid for, was the name of the degree rather than the skills that we might be developing. But we've got to treat them like customers.
I don't see a hand going up. There's one in the back. How many people have heard of Martin Gurri? Gurri. Interesting. Not sure if I'm Gurri. Gurri.
We wrote a book called Revolt of the Public. Actually, in our follow-up to Coddling the American Mind, we're incorporating a lot of his insight. It's essentially just that the transfer, what he calls it a phase shift, that essentially the move towards social media and billions of people getting to talk to each other at an unprecedented scale is even more significant than we fully understand.
Yeah, and I'll just add to it, and then we'll go to the question. As a result of that, the public, and he defines the public not as the masses, but an interested group of people on a particular topic. So the public is ever shifting. Because the public now has information parity, and actually in some cases superiority to what he calls essentially the elites are now held accountable in a way by the public that they never were before. If you think about the 20th century, the elites in media controlled the information the public got, and so how they were evaluated. And I think part of the disruption going on right now, the cancel culture, the intimidation, the crushing of dissent, the censoring through the tech platforms, is a little bit of the elites trying to put the genie back in the bottle versus the public trying to say we want accountable and responsive government, not out of control government. So I think it's an interesting sort of overlay, and I think it's an interesting book. Get the edition from 2018 because he has an updated chapter in there that's quite good. You should read first. Yes, sir.
Hi, Roger Custer here. John, you mentioned that your center is going to have a school choice focus coming up soon. I'm wondering if you could talk more about that and also the vision for the Atlas Center for U.S. and Canada.
I'll ask Matt Warner to talk about that. I'm excellent at delegation.
So in response to some developments that we had been supporting, and many people supported, and you'll learn more about this tomorrow at breakfast with Robert Enlow from Ed Choice, with the victory in West Virginia done by Cardinal Institute to establish educational savings accounts in a state that just a few years ago didn't even have charter schools. You know, if you had looked at the state's sort of rankings on school choice opportunities, West Virginia was way at the bottom. And so I think that should give us a lot of hope, although a lot of credit goes to the enterprising group at Cardinal Institute to get that done. But after getting charter schools, they then got what is seen as sort of the whole banana for school choice, which is education savings accounts. And so that has, coinciding with the pandemic, has opened up a lot of more enterprising activity across the U.S. And so we've been putting together additional funds for that specific opportunity with some of the hard-charging, exciting projects that are happening in the U.S. So in addition to what John and Niels have been leading at the center in terms of what has been a really marked shift in buy-in among U.S. and Canadian think tanks to be looking at disadvantaged communities and the ways that free market solutions can make a huge difference there. Education is going to, in 2022, be a key part of what we're doing.
And I'll just, if I could, Matt, from a Canadian context, I mean, the Americans utilize our healthcare reports in a sort of negative way, like don't be like Canada. But on education, we offer a really positive example of education choice. I mean, just the fact that at the federal level, we don't have a Department of Education for K-12. So we have a lot of experimentation in the provinces. And again, in British Columbia, where I'm from, which has the highest level of students in independent or private schools, we have up to a 50% voucher for private schools, depending on how much tuition they charge. So it's a scaling voucher. So there's a great example, and we have some papers aimed at a U.S. audience on what changes Canada, at least the positive changes that were made in Canada, might be applicable to the U.S.
According to Randy Weingarten, the head of the largest teachers union, as a result of that, I'm sure the public schools in Vancouver have collapsed, fallen apart, and are defunded, and the children are floating in the ocean somewhere?
Correct.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left. Any further questions from any of you? Feel free to pop your hand up. We'll start winding it down. Concluding remarks on where we're at and where we need to go. I would particularly like to suggest in your concluding remarks, give people just a touch of hope and optimism, how we can overcome this little existential threat that we're in terms of the cancel culture, the threats to free speech across the spectrum.
So you're asking me to lie?
I'm asking you to find your inner better self, Greg. I know you can do it.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I'm very pessimistic about where things are. I'm extremely optimistic about the future. I think you're seeing opportunities for change develop right in front of our eyes. From a Canadian context, not having to rely on the mainstream media, which is predominantly left of center, has been absolutely amazing for our organization. We had 4 million unique Canadians last year come to our website. So that's give or take 13% of the Canadian population. So just think about that in a US context. We reach 20 million Canadians through our social media feeds. We're influencing about 85,000 students through our education programs. So I'm really optimistic. I think all the efforts that I see across North America by think tanks, and now the opportunities for change that are emerging, these little rays of light, like in Virginia, like inflation. I mean, inflation's not positive again, but it offers a real opportunity for change. And I think significant change is coming in the short term, like the 3 to 5 year window, particularly in a Canadian context. So I just, the more we can do as a movement, the faster that change will come and the better off we'll be, because the solutions will be right there for people who want to implement them.
Go ahead, Greg.
My co-author and I both think that this might be like the quietest year of the next decade. We actually think things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. So we finished Coddling the American Mind with a more optimistic ending than we actually felt, and I've always kind of regretted that to a degree. So how many of you, and I was about to commit a microaggression by asking how many of you are Americans, but actually to ask how many of you are from the US? Okay. So one thing that I do want to ask, though, is that, and particularly among conservatives and libertarians, that there's a sense that it's okay to sort of give up on American higher education. It's not okay. They're still going to be deciding who our Supreme Court people are, who our politicians are for a long time in the future. And if you haven't contacted your university president to ask them to get rid of their speech codes, to stand up for the academic freedom of their students and faculty, anytime an issue comes up, early and often, to adopt things like the very pro-academic freedom Chicago statement, to have an orientation, this is nuts. Most schools in the US do not have an orientation explaining the, in some ways, counterintuitive idea of freedom of inquiry, of the discovery of ignorance, of why we need academic freedom. They've never even had it explained, so no wonder why they're hostile to it. They've only heard downside. And then the poll. Everyone who needs to contact their where their kids go, where they went, both graduate and undergraduate, and ask them to do these basic things before we lament. And also, I also published something at Persuasion talking about, if you run companies, how to keep your company out of the culture war, because the way things are going at the moment, students are coming in expecting complete conformity from the corporations they end up in. It's a good reason to hire from state schools, but even then, you end up having people coming out thinking, not being able to handle conformity. And we give Haidt and I give a list of things that you can ask to make sure that because once you reach a stage where every corporation in the U.S. thinks of itself as an expressive organization, the disaster that's going to happen, that if you have the wrong political beliefs, you can't get hired in the U.S., that's one of the reasons why we're so worried about things getting much worse before they get better.
Well, I'm a reckless optimist. In 2019, I was asked to write a positive op-ed about why 2020 was going to be such a good year. And I talked about, declining poverty and, all these wonderful things. And then
no pandemic.
I did not see that one coming. Anyway, so I am going to still be recklessly optimistic. And I think just from seeing students, I think that they are exhausted by the culture wars. They're exhausted by wokeness. They're so afraid to speak that I know that when I say something that most people think is controversial, but I think in this room would be perfectly reasonable, like oil's not the worst thing in the world, and if you got rid of it, we couldn't have an event like this if you got rid of petroleum, because all the plastic would have to go and we'd be sitting in the dirt. they go, oh, you could say that out loud, and and they're so relieved. And in fact, I was speaking to a PhD student just the other day, and we were just getting to know each other, and she was just so excited that she could say something positive about petroleum, and that even if you are concerned about the environment, you don't have to think that you have to shut down your entire economy to solve this problem that we can't solve this way. And so the idea that give them space to voice those opinions, they really want to. I think that there is a major silent majority, even on campuses, even in a left-wing country like Canada, that people are exhausted by having to watch everything that they say, and they feel that it's just so refreshing to be able to say things out loud. So for me, I make a point of doing any media that anybody asks me, and it's interesting, when I think I might have pushed it, that's when I get the best fan letters. I get people going, oh, that was so great. I'm so glad you said something just so commonsensical, right? So we can't be afraid that our ideas are wrong or they're offside. In fact, more people than not will think that we are reasonable. And I also feel good that on Twitter they called me a Marxist, so I totally confused them about how we go about it.
One of the news operations I'm involved with is funded by Putin. Just wanted you to know that. So you're a Marxist and I'm a Russian troll, I guess. So the reason I think that the threats are very real is I think the left, the radicalized left, is highly aligned in what they want to accomplish. They want to destroy the essence of the founding of the West, and particularly in the U.S., as we would define it in our founding documents, is that the individual is sovereign over government. This is unusual in the Western democracies. In most of the Western democracies, either the crown, even though it might be Great Britain, but nevertheless, sovereignty rests within the government apparatus. Here, it rests within the people, and that is a problem. Because when the people are sovereign, the radical leftists can't get accomplished what they want. That is why Barack Obama and Elizabeth Warren said, you didn't build that. They are trying to say you as an individual are powerless without the collective, and that wasn't accidental. They're continuing those kind of themes ever since. But I'm an optimist in terms of the outcome for a host of reasons. When I was a junior in college, so you can do the math on this, figure out how old I am, besides the gray hair, that was when the failed hostage rescue happened in the desert in Iran. And I walked, so the news had hit, it was devastating news at the time, and I was walking to a class going down a hallway in a building, and a friend of mine was sitting on the floor named Jim Jeanette, and he was weeping. This was a very emotional thing. We're 20 years old, this terrible thing happened. And we all grew up at that time. This is the spring, winter of 1980. The assassinations of the 60s, the inflation of the 70s, the resignation of Nixon, the various wars in the Middle East, and it was just one calamity after another, after another, after another. And of course, the Iranian hostage crisis. And then in the end, the failed rescue attempt. And he looked up at me with pleading eyes and said, will America ever be great again? It seemed like it was over. And I think sometimes people think that today, and I reject that. The reason we will come out of this, and I'm not saying we're going to come out of it easily, I think there's a lot of hard road ahead. And I think there's a lot of hard road ahead in different parts of our society. But the reason I'm so optimistic that we're going to get there is because I just got back the results of a poll that I'm doing with some other people on these kind of questions about what is Americanism? What does it mean to be, whether you want to, let's think of Americanism in the continental sense, the North American continent, who we are as a people, both in Canada and the US, versus what the left is now doing. And by and large, as we've sort of discussed here today, the left is anti-American values. Again, Canada and the US. They're anti-free speech. They're anti-tolerance. They're anti-praising achievement. They want to attack achievement. They are for identifying and defining somebody by their group identity, which is dehumanizing. They think whether you're black, white, or brown, gay or straight, tall or short, fat or skinny, or some other victim that they come up with, that defines your total humanity. We actually believe in all of the humanity of an individual. And in the end, that is actually in keeping with the natural human condition. And I think that the investors on the right, the libertarian, conservatarian right, are now investing in better places. We're starting to build the tanks, the airplanes, the ships, et cetera, that we need to compete in culture, because in the end, this is actually, the arena is culture. And all three of you do a great job at competing in culture. Could we get a final round of applause for our panel? And of course, I especially want to call out Niels, who is my co-director of the Center for the U.S. and Canada. And Niels, it has been a joy to get to know you over this last year, and really, really fun. And thank you so much for being part of this. And thank you, Matt and Atlas, for this. And we're finished.